Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the second session of the Tortoise COVID inquiry. I'm reminded in this conversation, even the very first one, that part of this, I suppose, is just an exercise in remembering. When in that very first session, when Nazir Afzal and Joshua Rosenberg introduced the case against the government and if you like, the case for the government, Joshua mentioned the position the government took on March the 3rd, the formula of contain, delay, research and mitigate. And it was like hearing something from a statement lost in time. And then you realize, actually, that's only 8 or so months ago. So part of this exercise to try and understand what happened and remember things that we've forgotten or just didn't notice at the time. And this next session, this next hour, is to look at the lost month. And the argument that I have to say was driven by some people in Whitehall, in no small part by the Sunday Times' investigation into what happened in February, the piecing together of the seemingly relaxed approach to the coronavirus in that critical month, as we saw it unfolding in Italy. And we're going to follow the same format as we followed in the first session, which is to ask Nazir Afzal from the CPS to set out the prosecution case, if you like, against the government on this particular issue, and then ask Joshua Rosenberg, who may not be arguing his own view, but we hope is going to argue forcefully the case for the government in this, what happened, and then once again try to bring in as much as possible in terms of voices. We're delighted that Nigel Edwards from the Nuffield Trust is going to join us, that Sonia Adesera, who's of course a doctor from the National, hello Sonia, thank you so much for joining us, a clinical fellow, the National Medical Director's clinical fellow. And I hope that Jonathan Calvert of the Sunday Times is here as well. And Cameron Abbasi is here too. So we look forward to hearing from all of those. But why don't we start, Nazir, with your argument on what happened in the last month?
Yes, James. Britain, as we all know, first went into national lockdown on 23rd of March. And Italy's lockdown started 2 weeks earlier. We already had images on our television of overwhelmed Italian hospitals, doctors dying, nurses dying. They were dominating the news. We saw how they lacked ventilators, intensive care beds, protective equipment. There was a very simple message from the European Society of Intensive Care Medicine on the 7th of March, which said, quote unquote, get ready. We weren't ready, and we got ready, as we said, when we locked down on 23rd of March. So why were alarm bells not ringing in the UK? We learned that there were Cobra meetings and SAGE meetings in February, none of which we learned were chaired by the Prime Minister. Our initial response was to ban essential travel from mainland China. We knew that the threat was imminent. We knew we had the powers available. We had the Civil Contingency Act. We had the powers available, but the government was clearly reluctant to use them. We then had a meeting, a Cobra meeting on the beginning of March, where the Prime Minister did chair, and that's when the action plan was published. This was a plan, as we've learned, based on how we've dealt with or would have dealt with influenza and other infectious diseases. The Prime Minister is keen to call the Leader of the Opposition Captain Hindsight. So let's look at what actually did happen and when it happened. The first SAGE meeting on coronavirus we're aware of took place on the 22nd of January, and that's where there was a decision taken not to carry out temperature checks. On the 24th of January, the government tried to track down 2,000 passengers recently arrived from Wuhan for testing. On the 29th of January, travellers returning from Wuhan were made to quarantine for 14 days. The government issued its first hand-washing advice on the 2nd of February, which of course we all remember and will never forget, I imagine. On the 4th of February, some scientific modelling took place. It found that we didn't really know whether isolation or contact tracing would work, but it felt that it would probably would contain the spread of the virus. On the 11th of February, the same group advised government that the direct impact of stopping mass gatherings will be low, and that stopping leisure activities would have a much larger effect On the 13th of February, SAGE concluded that neither travel restrictions within the UK nor the prevention of mass gatherings would be effective in limiting transmission. And we probably believe that was completely wrong. Over the next few days, the government advised people not to travel to East Asia. On the 26th of February, SAGE advised the UK government there was a possibility of reducing the peak of infections by 50 or 60% if the government called for the ceasing of social contact outside of home, school, and the workplace. On the 28th of February, the first British national died from COVID. The Prime Minister offered his condolences and then told us to wash our hands for 20 seconds or more. The papers prepared for that SAGE meeting at the beginning of March showed that intervention was absolutely key here. And if we'd applied it earlier, 3 weeks earlier, or if China had applied it 3 weeks earlier, they could have produced a 95% reduction in deaths and infections. And again, the government's response was another hand hygiene advert campaign. Now we know that Italy locked down when it did. Let's look at what happened between the 12th and the 16th of March. The first thing the government did on the 12th of March was announce that it was moving from contain to delay, which I think Joshua mentioned earlier in terms of the strategy. What they did immediately was to stop the UK's community testing and contact tracing program. They stopped it. And now testing would only take place in hospitals for people with severe symptoms. Everybody else with symptoms was asked to self-isolate. As many of you know, my brother was...
Nazir, sorry, excuse me for interrupting. What date is that? March 12th?
We're now in the middle of March.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so prior to lockdown. Mm-hmm. So they were told to stop community testing. My brother was one of those that was told that no tests were available in the community. The government was still considering banning large events, but we heard earlier that large events took place. The government moved to mitigate a week after the Italian lockdown. And again, their response was slow. It was not clearly articulated. On the 18th of March, the Prime Minister said that schools would close, and that was allowed to happen 2 or 3 days later rather than immediately. The government also, as you know, and we all know, called for thousands or hundreds of thousands of volunteers, and 700,000 people ultimately volunteered. We still don't know what they actually end up doing. We know that if control measures had been brought in earlier, that this would have had a greater impact on the pandemic. Lives could have been saved. The pandemic may have been ended sooner.
Nazir, thank you. Joshua Rosenberg.
Well, James, thank you very much indeed once again for generously asking me to put the case on behalf of the government. I shall try and express it as best I can. These are the arguments which I think the government might put if it chose to, but perhaps some of them that I'm going to put wouldn't be the ones that they most want to stress. We're talking about the lost month of February. As Nazir explained, in fact, the period that is really of concern started a week earlier and continued to the very beginning of March. Jonathan Calvert and the Insights team at the Sunday Times published an excellent analysis in April of what they called the 38 days when Britain sleepwalked into disaster. Just to give you the background, let's go back to January, Wednesday the 22nd of January. That's when SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, met, and it became clear to SAGE that coronavirus was much more infectious than flu, with each person who got coronavirus likely to infect up to 3 others. Flu was perhaps just over 1. The SAGE meeting led in turn to the first meeting of Cobra, the cross-departmental committee that responds to national emergencies. That was just 2 days later, on Friday the 24th of January. Although there were no confirmed cases in the United Kingdom at that stage, holding the meeting was clearly the right thing to do. Unfortunately, Boris Johnson was absent. That was a mistake, but it may have been understandable. The Sunday Times reports it was a big day for the Prime Minister. There was a triumphal mood in Downing Street because the withdrawal treaty from the European Union was being signed in the late afternoon. It could have been the defining moment of his premiership. But of course, we didn't know that the world was going to change. And Nazir is perfectly entitled to say that the government was concentrating on Brexit and before that on austerity, as he did in the last session. But nevertheless, that's where we were. Now, that was bad enough, but the situation got worse. Boris Johnson went on to miss 4 further Cobra meetings on the virus. There was flooding. He had to complete the EU withdrawal, he reshuffled his cabinet, and he then went away to the countryside to Chevening, where he spent most of the 2 weeks over half term with Carrie Simons, who at that stage was pregnant. It wasn't until the 2nd of March that Johnson attended his first Cobra meeting on the crisis, and that's when the government agreed the action plan that you just referred to, James: contain, delay, research and mitigate, and the wash your hands for as long as it takes to say happy birthday twice. Now, clearly, during those 5 weeks, the government should have acted more decisively. It's worth pointing out the one thing that President Trump got right was to ban foreign nationals who'd been in China during the previous 2 weeks from entering the United States, subject to exceptions. He issued what the Americans call a proclamation at the very end of January. But in the UK, there was a sense of drift during those crucial weeks in February. A senior Department of Health official is quoted by the Sunday Times as saying, "A pandemic was always at the top of our national risk register, always, but when it came, we just slowly watched. We could have in Germany, but instead we were doomed by our incompetence, our hubris, and our austerity." Well, the reason was, clearly lack of leadership, and the Insight team, and I know you'll be hearing from Insight later, and they'll explain what went on, how it was that Boris Johnson was in the Prime Minister's country home, matters about his working holiday with his fiancée, the divorce being finalised, settlement being announced in the High Court. So he had a lot on his mind. Why didn't he grasp the situation more quickly? Well, as Defence Counsel, I can offer two alternatives. I can either say that he didn't get the support that he needed from the government machine, the scientists, the civil servants, the cabinet, or I can say that they didn't get the support they needed from him. There's a case to be made for the first of those options. He clearly wasn't getting on well with the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Mark Sedwill, but I have to say I prefer to take the second option. I have to say he failed to get a grip on the situation. In mitigation, he'd been Prime Minister for just 6 months. He didn't have the experience he needed to take the decisions that were required. He'd been Mayor of London for 8 years, but that was largely symbolic. He'd been Foreign Secretary for 2 years, but he hadn't had to take any major decisions there. He appointed advisors who'd managed to alienate the senior civil servants who he should have relied on. He had prevented experienced ministers like David Gauke and Dominic Grieve from getting re-elected after they voted against him on Brexit. There was a new House of Commons without experienced MPs who could become ministers, MPs who took independent positions. People like Geoffrey Cox and Tom Tugendhat were simply not welcome in government. And as I think Boris Johnson now recognises, it was a mistake to rely on Dominic Cummings in the way that he did. But you can feel just a little bit sorry for the Prime Minister, can't you? Nobody told him that it was going to be this difficult, and nobody told him that there would be unknown unknowns.
Thank you, Joshua. Joshua, thank you. I think that's let's put it this way, it's a very candid defence. So thank you very much for that. I suppose the key question in this, and if I might, I'm going to come to Sonia Adesara. Sonia, the reason I want to come to you is that you've got an advantage on the rest of us in that you're a doctor. And I suppose one of the key questions here is that, to an extent, the timeline that Nazia sets out is not so unreasonable, is not so negligent, if it were the case that this was a different kind of disease. My understanding is that doctors and medics, when they see the possibility of a pandemic, and one that's as infectious as this, raise an alarm bell. And that's the thing that doesn't make sense about February, is what kind of advice, if you like, the government was getting from the medical establishment and from science about the speed with which this virus would move.
Yeah, I think, I guess, firstly to say, I think, I agree with actually what I think both Joshua and Nazir alluded to, is that there were just a litany of mistakes by this government, and the delay and the incompetence, and it just seems, I guess, the inability to make decisions contributed to tens of thousands of deaths. But I guess I think something that maybe we've not quite touched upon is that there are structural weaknesses within our health and our political system that left us vulnerable to this virus. So it's now widely understood the lack of surge capacity within our healthcare system. And this is a consequence of, the hollowed out state. It's been worsening over the past few years. And actually there's been repeated warnings from professional groups, from the unions, from healthcare providers. And these have been ignored by the government. And I think also there's a problem which, within our health system, we don't have a unified, integrated healthcare system. And it can be very difficult. We actually have a very complex, fragmented, marketized healthcare systems. It's very difficult to have a coordinated response to a pandemic like this, when you've got unclear lines of accountability and large numbers of non-state actors involved. And lastly, I think, under the Lansley reforms, we've seen public health move away from, being put into local government, disrupting ties between the NHS and public health, and massive cuts to our public healthcare system as well in the past 10 years, which I think led to the incorrect decision, which Nazir highlighted, of the government in February looking at our incapacitated public health infrastructure, and then making that incorrect decision to stop community testing and tracing, going against WHO advice, because they simply thought our public health system wasn't able to manage that.
Sonia, can I just ask you one question on that? I really appreciate the point about surge capacity in the NHS, but with particular regard to February, one of my questions is around communication and the way expertise plays into government decision making. And what's your view on that, on the way in which the medical evidence gets translated into policy?
Yeah, so I think I think the first thing to say, I think there's been quite a lot of shock at how bad we've done, and how it looks like the scientific advice has been quite poor, and a lot of mistakes have been made. Because prior to this pandemic, UK was globally renowned for its global health expertise. We've in previous pandemics, we've exported our expertise to different countries. Yes. And I think that it's a few different things that the problem. I think firstly, the scientific world, we're very interconnected. We're used to collaborating, and yet we had this really bizarre decision for SAGE to be, for the members of SAGE and for the advice that they've been given, to be kept secret from the government at the start of the pandemic. And I think that was incorrect. What we needed to have was an open system, where the advice was open, and where actually we could have experts from across the field, from across the country, be feeding into that advice. I think secondly, we should have, I think there has been, the conflicts of interest among, advisors, and among scientific advisors, been quite problematic. And I also think we should have had, the role of the chief medical officer and the chief scientific officer. Their role is to give the scientific advice, that should be open. And then it's the role of the government then to take that scientific advice and then to make the policy decisions. And I think we've seen a blurring of those lines, and actually the politicization of that advice. But thirdly, I think if you look at the members of SAGE, I think there was an over-reliance on modelling, and not considering other factors, which I think if you look at the members of SAGE, we didn't have intensivists, we didn't have representatives, from nursing, from social care, from the front line. We didn't have people that have worked, in SARS. So I think that lack of insight from the front line meant that, key problems that we then went and faced could have been, anticipated if they had more insight from the front line.
So Sonia, thank you. I'm gonna. I hope you'll come back in the course of the conversation. I want to bring in Nigel Edwards, just picking up on exactly that point, because actually you've done something which I fear we are in danger of missing, which is beginning to talk about the openness of SAGE, the differences of opinion within SAGE, and how that different advice and those conflicting opinions can get relayed to government and in fact communicated to the public. But Nigel, you're no stranger to all of those issues. Do you want to start by just telling us how you see this particular problem, what you think happened in February?
In fact, the NHS was talking about COVID in February, but a quick scan back through the Health Service Journal, the sort of trade mag for the NHS and the BMJ, doesn't really show that much discussion of COVID, rather interestingly. One thing I think that might be worth reflecting on is whether Italy, to some extent, might have taught us slightly the wrong lessons first of all about the type of disease, the extent to which it was a respiratory disease as opposed to what it now turns out to be a much more complex multi-system disease. So there was a bit of a rush to buy ventilators and to set up the Nightingale hospitals, although it was never clear how those were going to be staffed, but those were largely set up to provide respiratory support rather than. So I think we probably ought to just remember that there was quite a lot of uncertainty about the nature of the problem, the right medical response. But I'm inclined to agree with almost everything that Sonia said here about both the membership of SAGE having some severe gaps about, particularly in terms of social care, the extent to which the behavioural advice it was getting was reliable, but also about the transparency of what was going on. One thing I think that we should just reflect on is that there's been a sort of longer term problem, which Sonia alluded to in sort of public policy around the NHS, which has been running it extremely lean over the years. In fact, so lean that it's probably threadbare. With some of the lowest numbers of beds, acute hospital beds in the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, developed countries. Very, very low numbers of intensive care beds, very significant staff shortages, and buildings which have meant that we've had rates of nosocomial infection, people actually catching COVID in hospital, which you just don't see in Germany. So I think the NHS actually, however, seems to, despite having been run to this sort of point of almost breaking point, didn't do too badly. It wasn't overwhelmed. The bits that have gone really badly wrong, interestingly, are those that have been subject to sort of major efficiency improvements, like our laboratory system, the NHS supply chain, the procurement, the procurement functions, and these are things which are run from the centre. And one of the reasons one of the ways the NHS seems to have done well is it's adopted, rather surprisingly for those of us who know it, because it is highly centralised, a much more devolved approach to decision making. So people locally were able to make decisions. Where central government's got involved, it's really revealed some of its very major problems about having sufficient expertise in procurement, in logistics, and this sort of cult of the generalist, which seems to date back centuries, probably. The idea that a degree in classics and 6 months of Hindi means you can run India at age 23 definitely seems to be a problem. And this, so maybe Dominic Cummings had a point about that. Even if they were professional, the size and complexity of trying to do these things centrally means you run into problems. So while the NHS had some issues about the extent to which it did manage to work with the voluntary sector and social care locally, often it didn't do too badly. But central government has completely lost, I think, its capability. So as it doesn't know how to talk to local government, maybe doesn't trust it, it adopted an approach of talking to Serco or Deloitte, because if you're in a big bureaucracy, it's probably easier to contract with a big bureaucracy. Unfortunately, I think those organisations have proved that they weren't up for this very challenging task. I'm not sure I want to criticise that.
Nigel, can I just pick up on a couple of the points you made? Firstly, can I just put the point that you and Sonia both have made separately about SAGE? You talk about gaps in its skills base around social care and behavioural science, but also this transparency point you've both raised. Is it reasonable of us to expect that SAGE's findings should have been made public? Is that something that other advisory body countries do?
I'm not sure of practice in other countries, but the general approach if you're doing science is to show you're working and let other scientists look at it. And I think that's the principle that should have been applied here, because as Sonia was saying, it's the job of the politicians to turn that science into policy, and that often is something that like Bismarck said is better not looked at. But I think the science that lies behind it, there's no reason why that shouldn't be transparently discussed.
And then can I just pick up on one other thing? This is not directly a sort of February issue, but when you said the rates of infection in hospital were much higher in the UK than they were in Germany, what's the reason for that?
Well, this is anecdotal. Talking to colleagues at Berlin Technical University who've been looking at this. I think, well, one reason is Germany decided to use more hospital at home and community treatment quite early on. So although they've got many more beds than we have, by a factor of over 2, if I remember rightly, they adopted more of a community delivered approach. But because they've got all those additional beds, so they were much more able to segregate patients. They've also built more hospitals with single rooms and bigger and more generous corridors, and more of an ability to create flow, to create separate flows through the hospital. A lot of our buildings are quite elderly. They've often got quite narrow corridors. There's a lot of patients in 6-bed bays. And because of I think one of the things that wasn't fully understood in February, and again, we do need to be really careful with applying the retrospectoscope to this, is I don't think we understood the extent to which was asymptomatic transmission, which is what really went wrong with one of the things that went wrong with the care homes. There's a number of issues with that. Other countries got caught out by that too. But so that would mean that you could admit a patient who doesn't appear to have COVID, you put them in a 4-bed bay, they then develop symptoms, and you move them, and while they were sitting in that bay, and possibly even while you move them, they're encountering other patients. And there's been some interesting papers published on that topic, which demonstrate that we do have a problem. And it seems from recent news reports that we continue to have a problem with cross transmit, with so-called nosocomial transmission.
Yeah,
that's really interesting. So I'm just going to forget. Sorry, do you want to come back in?
I agree with that, and I'd say actually we're still making these mistakes right now. In that, in the past few weeks in my hospital, we've had breakouts on the ward, and there are issues like with having patients in bays, poor ventilations in many of our hospitals. Also, we have a problem with high, where I work, lots of rota gaps, so we have to use locum staff who are not getting tested regularly, and then also we have the problem where our doctors and nurses are getting tested regularly, but our cleaners, our caterers, our porters, many other NHS workers who are often outsourced, not employed by the NHS, are not getting that regular testing. But then the other issue about how we transmitted the virus from the NHS into social care, I think that there was that the headlines are saying the NHS was discharging people with COVID. And I think actually the point that it misses is that there is always a problem in the past few years of intense fear that we're going to run out of beds, and there's a huge pressure to discharge patients. Every day we're trying to think, who can we discharge? And that happened in February. That's also happening again now, where we're really we're concerned that we're running out of beds. So I think then people get discharged maybe prematurely, or not considering that they may have the infection. And that again is a result of that acute fears about running out of hospital beds, which I guess Germany's got less of a problem.
That's really useful. Funnily, even just in these first 2 sessions, it's becoming a thread of the, if you like, the knock-on effects, the second-order effects of the way in which this is being handled. We've got a session which is at 11:45, which is, with each of these Fridays, we're going to take a look specifically inside the NHS and try and look chronologically at that. Obviously, there's some things that will run through the whole year. But can I come to bring Jonathan Calvert, if you're there, Jonathan? As you'll know, we in journalism are not above copying each other's homework, and this is possibly, this whole hour in a sense is copying your homework on that report that Joshua mentioned. The missing 38 days. What happened in February? We put a link to the story itself here. I just wondered, in the months since, what, if anything, has changed in your understanding of what happened in February, and whether you've got a clearer sense of why it happened?
Yeah, I suppose that inevitably there's always more information that comes out, isn't there? Our broad thesis of that piece was that we had the best pandemic plan in the world, but we didn't, because of the years of austerity, and also the obsession with Brexit, which had meant all emergency planning had gone into Brexit in those days. So that when this virus hit, and it obviously was serious, because you could see that it was more infectious than Spanish flu in January, they should have hit the ground running. And so the problems we now talk about with the fact that you had lots of infections in hospital are due to the fact that they didn't hit that ground running. They didn't get all the kind of the personal protective equipment sourced in from abroad. In fact, they ended up giving China lots of our PPE, but our stocks had been really, really run down because of austerity and Brexit. And as you would find during the pandemic, lots of it was out of date. Equally, we didn't have sufficient testing capacity, and we were really hopeless at ramping it up. I mean, the difference in Germany is that Germany would be able to test their NHS staff, and if you look at the beginning, the weeks after lockdown, the government's reporting huge problems with the fact that there's so much infection in British hospitals, and they weren't able to test any of their medical staff at the time. I don't know if you remember this, but they were only testing the patients with it. Yes. They just didn't have the capacity. And I think more broadly, what we kind of now understand about all of this is that, and what we wrote about was the kind of complacency of the government in that month in February. And there is a kind of astonishing speech at the beginning of February that Boris Johnson gives in Greenwich at the Admiralty Hall, in which he talks about, it's a Brexit speech. He's just delivered Brexit. Brexit was delivered on the Friday, and on Monday morning he gives his big set piece speech, and he's talking about how now we're kind of going to be a nation of shipgoers and trade again, just how we will build up, and he talks about this irrational panic over viruses such as over epidemics such as coronavirus. He didn't treat it seriously. Also, it didn't fit in with the government's shall we say, libertarian views of how we should treat these things. So, I mean, famously, Boris Johnson, I think he said it on more than one occasion, has said that his hero is the mayor in the film Jaws, who allowed all the people to get eaten on the beaches by keeping the beaches open. And he kind of very much had that approach to it. And as you see that, and I think what we know more and more, and what you can see more and more, is that the government's approach to this was to manage it, and rather than try and just take a quick intervention and crush it as much as they could early on, they felt that what they could do was manage it. They could delay, and then as infections built up, they could kind of have a look at the hospitals and just see if they're getting a bit fuller, and then they might bring in one intervention or another intervention. And so what you hear, and especially, and it becomes kind of, as we go through February, but it becomes especially clear in March, is they keep saying, we are going to intervene, but we're not going to do it yet. And it's such a mistake, because what they were doing, and where in the end we have the worst number of deaths in Europe, and I think there is no doubt about that, is because when we finally went into lockdown, we had allowed infections to spread. And so, I mean, if you look at the back modeling done by...
Sorry, forgive me interrupting, but I just wanted to get into two elements of your reporting. One was personal, and one was systemic, right? And I appreciate that we all like to personalize this around Boris Johnson, but there is an argument for it in this case. And I wondered what you made of the response afterwards in two elements on the personal side on Johnson. One was, well, you know what, Cobra meetings are often chaired by someone other than the Prime Minister. It's not so unusual for there to be a series of Cobra meetings that are chaired by, cabinet ministers rather than the PM. And then on the other side of the equation, the real story is it was much more than just he was in post-Brexit euphoria. There was just so much on his personal plate. He went to Chevening. He was trying to resolve the issues with his own family around divorce. He was, Carrie wanted time before she had the baby. There was even these suggestions that he was seeing if he could get this manuscript for the Shakespeare book off his decks, because it would try and help him financially. In the weeks and months since you published the piece, I wondered what you reflected on both of those different arguments around Boris Johnson's conduct in February.
Sorry, what was the first point?
The first one is the argument that says, frankly, Jonathan Calvert and the Insight team have over-egged the importance of, the PM chairing Cobra meetings.
Yeah, I mean, when they came out with this extraordinary response to us, which was like this kind of like 50-page blog, and we went back and looked, and there is no evidence to say that prime ministers like David Cameron and Theresa May and Gordon Brown before them all were kind of wanted to be hands-on, and so they all chaired Cobra meetings. They gave us examples of cases where the Prime Minister hadn't chaired a Cobra meeting. They used Alan Johnson during one of the. I think it was a crisis in 2009. And then when you looked at it, in fact, Gordon Brown, being the Prime Minister at the time, he had actually been on the phone to Cobra because he'd actually been in a visit to Poland. They gave us another example of Grant Shapps chairing a Cobra, but that was because it was a collapse of Thomas Cook overnight, and Boris Johnson was on the plane to New York for a meeting in the UN. So there was no precedent for that, and that clearly wasn't the case. And I think Boris Johnson in that month there were lots of things going on, but he'd had quite a busy time. The election had been just before Christmas. Okay, he had gone away for a week in Mystique or wherever it was in January, but I think there was a kind of exhaustion at the end of the Brexit process when they finally delivered it in January, on January the 31st. And yeah, he had loads on his plate. He has the most complicated private life of any prime minister we've ever. I mean, how many prime ministers have been the fathers of, I think it's something like 5 babies outside while married. While married to someone else. He was having to sort all that out. He was making the big announcement about getting engaged to Carrie and the fact that she was pregnant, and he had to square that with his family. He had a lot of competing things in his mind. I think
the Shakespeare book is that true, or was that just a rumor? Do you think?
We've looked at that several times, and we can't work out whether he was. We don't know what happened to the Shakespeare book. He certainly paid a huge advance for it, and still hasn't delivered it. And it was supposed to be out this year, but we've never been able to see whether he was actually kind of trying to complete it.
And Jonathan, one very small thing, which is, why was he in Chevening, given the Prime Minister's country residence is Chequers?
Oh, because Chequers was actually being redecorated or something at the time. So there was no particular reason.
All right, then can I just pick up on Joshua's point, which is he argued that you could either say, look, the Prime Minister let down the system of Whitehall and Sage support, or to an extent that Whitehall and Sage support failed to fully apprise him of the scale of what he was facing. What do you make of that second argument, that this was not a personal failure, as much as we can see the points about the personal, this was something systemic in government in February?
I think, what you can see is there are lots of people warning the government, and there are people on Sage who are, you take someone like Jeremy Farrar, who says, we were making absolutely clear at the beginning of February that this was serious. Because it was. You don't. The problem with the virus was that it was just so much more infective than any others, and so it may have a low death rate, but it was going to spread, and it had already spread hugely. You only had to see what had happened in the hospitals in Wuhan to see the chaos that it had caused almost instantly, and so they were getting a lot of advice to say that this is a really serious problem that you've got to tackle. And at that stage in February, I think the key thing was preparation, and it was because we didn't know how many cases we were going to get, and we were at the stage. And that stage, the idea was we had the best contact tracing system in the world, but I mean, the first chap to really get it, who bring it over here, was a man called Steve Walsh, and he was a super spreader. I don't know if you remember.
Yes, I remember.
And they managed to contact when they actually started to go through his contacts. They found lots and lots and lots of people who Steve Walsh had spread it to, and a lot of them didn't have symptoms. I mean, and so they knew about asymptomatic spread at that point anyway. I mean, it's kind of but as it progressed, contact tracing just could not cope with the numbers.
Yes.
And there was a failure insofar as they didn't know how many cases there were. I mean, our surveillance system was just blind. And then eventually we made that even worse by stopping contact tracing completely. But we had to, because again, when we should have been preparing, we should have been ramping up our testing capacity, bringing in private firms and laboratories, etc. But we didn't.
Yes.
And so we just didn't have. I mean, the reason we stopped contact tracing because we didn't have the tests. I mean, we didn't even have the tests to be able to test our doctors in hospitals.
Jonathan, thank you. Can I turn to Cameron Abassi, because actually it seems, Cameron, that you're the sort of, if you like, it's the natural place to hand the baton on, in that there are issues about, quote unquote, the unpreparedness of the NHS and the health system. And Cameron, I know you've spent a fair deal of time reporting for the BMJ and others on this. Nigel set out for us a little bit of preparedness at a local level and a failure at a central level. But what Jonathan was just describing was, even when you did see in February the scale of the problem, it was very hard to be able to pull on any levers that were going to be able to respond to it. What do you make of that? Cameron, you may be frozen. I fear you are frozen. Cameron, forgive me, I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to ask my colleague Sam just to see whether we can sort you out. Can you hear me now? No. While we wait to hear and hope that Cameron comes back online, I did want to just pick up on 2 points that the couple of people made in the chat. One was, I wanted to go to Simon Briscoe, if Simon's there. Simon, because right at the very, very beginning, you picked up on something, and I don't know exactly what you're pointing to, which was that the first deaths in the UK were possibly before that January the 28th date that Nazir had given at the top. Is that right? I'm hoping I'm hearing from Simon.
Is he referring to the article in The Sun about the people in Kent who got the disease back in?
He might be, but I don't know whether that's proven. Is that proven?
Yeah, there is somebody with a death certificate. He actually picked up something in late December, and he died in January. And his death certificate does say COVID. The coroner found it to be COVID, and so it's possible that either this person got it at the end of December, or maybe they had something else and then went into hospital and contracted the virus in hospital. Either way, it's not known really how early they got it.
I see that they contracted in hospital, but that possibly would mean.
Yeah, because I think they went ill in the middle of December or something, and then they got so ill at the end of December that they had to go to hospital.
Right.
And then.
I want to just try and stick, if we can, to sort of things that happened in February too, and I'm struck by, or at least February, in that early period of March. I wanted to bring in Elizabeth Diafaria. Forgive me, Elizabeth, I may have pronounced your surname wrong, but you pointed to some of the mass events that happened, and also there's a beginning of a discussion about the debate around February half term, and places like Ischgl in Austria. Elizabeth, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hello, hi. Sorry, I haven't got my video on at the moment.
No.
There were absolutely cases, because I know for a fact a friend had met the super spreader. His wife was at a hockey match or a match down in Kent at one of the schools, and she said, oh, my husband's got this illness. And then it did come out that it was actually COVID and he was the super spreader. And the wife was actually out and about meeting everybody and not isolating, etc., etc. But also what was interesting was London Fashion Week, because London Fashion Week was the 15th of February, and actually my son was working on it. And I think he got COVID around about I've got everything diarised in my diary, that's why I've gone back on it. He got it around about the 5th of March, only because I was visiting elderly relations and I was really concerned that he might have COVID. He isn't someone that gets respiratory stuff. He was coughing. He had a slight temperature of 38, and I phoned up for a test. We weren't able to get a test because he hadn't travelled anywhere. But he had worked on London Fashion Week and with the Beckhams, with Victoria Beckham, and it found out also later that the Beckhams did get it at London Fashion Week. They had COVID. So I think there was an awful lot that was coming out in the community. Obviously, that was around Westminster at the same time where Fashion Week was happening. But the Commonwealth Service on Monday, the 9th of March, this is where we saw, all the royal family. We saw Boris shaking hands, telling everyone you could shake hands and you wash your hands, but he was shaking hands with everybody. Prince Charles obviously contracted it earlier in March, or late March, April. And it just felt that at the time, there was so much that was going on. And, we all knew, as somebody on the chat said earlier, that we all knew already that we were, this was happening back in January, and I'm not a sort of I remember watching Newsnight around about sort of like second week of January, and watching a report on a Friday night, and I immediately went onto Amazon and ordered some sort of face masks, and just sort of like thought.
When was that, Elizabeth?
I think it was about, it could have been about it was a Friday in January, and it was either the sort of like the 20. Right. God, I sound like a complete nerd sitting here with my diary going back. I reckon Friday, the 24th of January, there was a Newsnight report, and it really was showing that, any normal, intelligent person would sort of think like, this looks like it could come up. This is traveling. This isn't just happening over there. And
so forgive me for interrupting. I'm just aware of time, Elizabeth. And
no problem.
Cameron, but I tell you what, I'm really interested in your throwaway comment just there, where you said, I sound like a real nerd. I think there's a very interesting thing. No, there was. I mean, I remember friends of mine too. A friend of mine, in early March, who wouldn't hug anyone. And everyone ostracized him and thought he was,
absolutely
a polite word, which is fusspot, but the reality is that I think a lot of this was cultural and attitude of people who are wary of illness. And
absolutely.
So anyway, we can get onto that. That's a whole sort of cultural national characteristics question, but we can come to that in another moment. I want to see if Cameron, are you there? Cameron Abbasi, are you back with us? I'm hoping we can hear from you.
Yes, I'm here, James.
We can't see you, but we can. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Can you hear me, James?
Yes. Could you just? I mean, Elizabeth.
Okay.
Just kind of gave us some of the dates where we kept on meeting people. But just before that, Jonathan was talking about the capability of the NHS to deal with this, and was picking up a little, I suppose, on Nigel's points, which were those central health functions around labs and testing.
Yeah, so I think what we need to think about here is that this was absolutely a failure of preparedness, both long-term preparedness and short-term preparedness, and resulted in those central failures that Nigel was talking about. And a lot of them fell off the reorganisation of the Public Health Service with the Health and Social Care Act in 2012. The service was reorganised. Those services were, they were automated essentially. And when it came to being prepared for the pandemic, we weren't prepared. The NHS was already working at limit with too much time. So when the pandemic hit us, we didn't have the capacity, we didn't have those core functions. We all
Cameron,
didn't. Yeah, sorry.
Cameron, I'm sorry to interrupt. Will you would you just drop out and come back in? For some reason or other, the line's really bad, so we just keep on getting cut off, which is a little frustrating. So come back and we'll try and bring you back in. I'm going to go back though on your point just to Nigel Edwards, if I might, because Nigel, I am keen that we're clear on where the responsibility lies between our politicians, but also where it lies in broader government and in the health service itself. Would you just go a little further on what you think about the operation of health and medical advice in February and early March?
Yeah, I perhaps we focused on the central advice, but I just want to pick up something Cameron was saying about what happened to public health. So Andrew Lansley put it in local government, which is quite sensible, was one of the few sensible things that his reforms did, but unfortunately didn't protect the budget. And then, of course, local government has been put to the sword, really, effectively. And so quite a lot of the machinery of public health was disrupted. And Public Health England, which is the national body, was an amalgamation of a very large number of different bodies, often with quite different cultures and ways of operating. And there was a huge sort of managerial task to sort of stick it back together. And the Department of Health and Social Care, which is the sort of the client for Public Health England, is an executive agency, so it reports directly to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State has control over it. He's sometimes spoken as though it's he hasn't and can't influence it. But the ability of, because of the cuts to central government, many of the expert people who you normally expect to find in a Department of Health, the Ministry of Health in other countries, have also had the opportunity to take early retirement or have been made redundant. So the ability of the Department of Health to hold Public Health England effectively to account has also been decimated, and the expertise in the permanent civil service, I think, significantly undermined. So I think one needs to sort of look beyond SAGE, which has got many really good people on it, to this sort of wider infrastructure of both public health advice, but also execution in terms of testing and tracing and contact tracing, which local government has traditionally done with public health departments.
All right, Nigel, thank you. I'm just going to go back because I do want to hear from Cameron if we can. Cameron, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, James. Is that any better?
Now we're talking. Yes. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, great. Well, Nigel took the words out of my mouth. But actually, I do want to reiterate that this was absolutely a failure of preparedness, both long-term preparedness and short-term preparedness. Long-term in the sense that we had all the changes that Nigel's outlined in relation to the Health and Social Care Act, which really disempowered public health. It rightly placed it locally, but then didn't empower it with funding and the resources to deliver public health in the way that we needed it to be delivered in this kind of situation. Followed up by a lack of preparedness following exercise sickness, which showed that we weren't ready for a pandemic of this nature. And I just want to introduce a new point here in terms of the long term, which is that this wasn't news to anybody. The people advising government, working with government, had learnt and seen enough from East Asia, because if you ever went to a conference in China, Hong Kong, and East Asian countries, SARS and how they responded to SARS was all that you'd hear people talking about. You would tour their hospitals, you would see how to deal with the pandemic. So anybody in a senior position, I know those people could not have failed to see the level of and the social cohesion and messaging that was required to deliver that. I'm talking fast because I know I've wasted a lot of time for you, sorry. And then in the shorter term, by February, WHO declared a public health emergency of international concern. We knew already from the case series published in the Lancet that this was a dangerous disease. It was killing a very high proportion of people who got it. And so action needed, there was human-to-human transmission, and it had spread beyond China. So it wasn't sufficient just to restrict travel from China. It had gone to many other places. So among the mistakes we made was not controlling our borders properly, which is rather ironic for a government that was elected on a Brexit ticket. Secondly, there was a central and crushing failure of test, treat and isolate. I think that's been, and that's the thing that needed investment and resources in February, and it wasn't given that. The people working on it were absolutely stretched and unable to deliver the kind of service that was required. And the third problem was the mixed message that then created confusion. You talked about whether this is a personal failure, spoke about unknown unknowns. There was, of course, there was a lot of that was unknown. There was also a lot that was worrying that was known. It boiled down a lot of Boris Johnson's leadership in how that messaging was delivered, how those decisions were taken, but equally the system wasn't set up to incorporate conversations about age, etc., which I agree with. So in a way, we were not ready because of the reason I've given you, because of austerity, the focus on Brexit, all of those things were very major factors as being symbolic in our response to this pandemic and wasting February.
Cameron, thank you, and thank you for persevering on the call. It's really interesting. The first conversation we had, the one that set out, how did the UK fare, that tried to put in context what the excess deaths and impact on health tells us about the UK's performance, and then the economics tells us, certainly makes it clear that there's a reason for holding an inquiry like this, even a journalistic one, in that there's clearly a case to be answered in the UK that is different from many other similar countries. The thing that's interesting about this hour is that as we come to the end of it, and I want to go back to Nazia and Joshua to hear their observations, you do see four really clear themes that come out just from the consideration of what happened in February. One is the points that Jonathan Calvert lays out in a way that are hard to ignore around leadership. Both the Greenwich speech and the outlook of the Prime Minister, but then also the private demands on the Prime Minister and how he responded to them, and how he picked up on the signals that were coming from government around those series of Cobra meetings. So there is clearly one political leadership point. I think there is the beginnings of a really important thread here around the way in which doctors and scientists began to discuss the evidence. And this is the broader SAGE question. It's a question that's clearly around transparency, it's around the skills base, and it's around the conflicting evidence, the way in which that was aired or in fact not aired publicly. But I take Cameron and Nigel's point, which is that there is something revealed around preparedness within the health system. Preparedness in the way that Cameron described it between long-term and short-term, but also the way Nigel described it between what was happening in the centre versus what was happening in hospitals. And I think what you heard from Sonia was this thread that runs through it that says, look at the way in which hospitals were coping with their institutional problem, the constraints that placed on them around the discharging of patients and the knock-on effects that had. And then finally, I just make a point, which is, I think there is a degree, this is the fourth point, around culture and the complacency of culture around medical risk or any extreme risk, that people are very skeptical, even critical of a quote unquote overreaction. And when you went through the list that you heard from Nazir at the top about the number of events that were held in February and in March, and the way that Elizabeth Diaferia talked about those things, whether it was half term or fashion week or the Commonwealth service, it does make you think, is there a question here which was around a prejudice against taking the disease seriously, and that had an impact too. So those are the sort of four threads that I take away. Others will take away other threads, but they will inform the final piece that we put together that tries to, as I said at the beginning, trace the who, what, why, and when of 2020 and COVID-19. But before we close this session, I just want to go back to Nazir and whether you have any further points, if you like, in the case against the government, and then to Joshua in the case for.
Thank you, James. Firstly, if I was Elizabeth at the end of January and wanted to buy a mask, what I would have done actually is given a bit of money to the Conservative Party and opened up a mask distribution company. I'd be a billionaire right now. So I think she missed a trick there. I think what we haven't touched on is whether or not, we've talked about whether the government did or didn't do. What was their motivation? And I think somebody said it earlier on around libertarianism. Is there an ideological reason why the government decided not to go early? Is it because there's a revulsion or against a large state? Is it because they felt they were reluctant to put in rules or restrictions or directly manage the population, things like border controls being non-existent? And I wonder whether or not that played a part, not only Boris Johnson's personal matters, but actually something more significant, and namely the fact that ideologically the government felt this was the wrong thing to do for the British public, given what they believe.
Thank you. Joshua Rosenberg?
Well, James, you're right to imply that the defence I put up of the Prime Minister wasn't much of a defence. I could have blamed his advisers. I could have blamed the fact that there wasn't the preparedness, as Emma has said. And all that is true. But I don't know how you run a country, but I do get the impression that in all organisations, and the British government is no different, there is one individual with whom the buck stops, and that is the Prime Minister of the day. Mm-hmm. And that person has to take a lead and has to take decisions and has to push the buttons and has to drive policy and has to get round all the failures that we have spoken about. And sadly, I'm afraid, Boris Johnson took his eye off the ball. There are all sorts of reasons to explain why that happened. It's terribly, terribly unfortunate. There's a great deal more I could say in mitigation. But ultimately, things would have been better if we hadn't started from here. And that's the best I can say. He did his best, but his best wasn't good enough.
Joshua, thank you. Well, it's as I said, it's a candid defence, a new term of art. I just wanted to be clear with everyone just what the process is, because I see some people have asked, Lucy Huberman and others asking, are we going to keep hold of the chat? Are we going to try and collate the documents that we get? To which the answer is yes. What we're going to do is we're going to keep a transcript of everything in the conversation. As we've said, we've pulled together dossiers because people have been kind enough to submit evidence. And also we will keep hold of the chat and then try to produce something that is a read-through of the entire inquiry, both what's been submitted by people verbally, but also to our teams in advance of these days. And then, as I said, in the middle of December, our aim is to produce a narrative of 2020 that tries to understand accurately as possible what happened in this past year. The next session goes to perhaps one of, some people would say, the most critical decision, which was the early decision around test and trace. And my colleague, Charles Whittell, is going to be chairing that. And it's going to start in just over 10 minutes' time at 10:30. But for now, thank you again to Nazir and Joshua, who set up the conversation we've had. But a particular thank you to Cameron Abbasi for his perseverance. A huge thank you to Sonia Adesera for bringing us a sense of what it's like, both in policy and comms terms, but in hospitals themselves. Nigel Edwards for giving us real context in understanding what's happened in our health system in 2020, and to Jonathan Calvert for, if you like, not only helping us understand the drivers of that story that was being the motivation for this session, but understanding what you've learned since. A big thank you to all of you. Please do join us again at 10:30 for the next session, following the science, early failures of test and trace. Many thanks.